we had the opportunity to bring in Joe to kind of get us pumped up, motivated, put a face to homelessness, give an example of what we're trying to achieve in terms of transformation or change from someone living on the streets now to being more of a productive part of our community or society and making a positive change. So that is sort of hopefully the catalyst of today's workshop and discussions, and hopefully some real things happening here in Penticton. So I'll just give a quick bio of Joe Roberts. You may have heard of Push for Change. You may have over the last few months or just recently. So Joe is a celebrated Canadian entrepreneur before he was 35 years old. He's a winner of the Ontario Premier's Award, the Courage to Come Back Award, and recently received an honorary doctorate from the Laurentian University. About 25 years ago, Joe was a homeless youth pushing a shopping cart around Vancouver's downtown east side. Joe is now in the middle of a campaign to push a shopping cart 9,000 kilometers across Canada to raise awareness and funds to prevent youth homelessness. Today is day 481, a 517-day trek. He's already walked 8,661 kilometers of the 9,000 in his plan. He's a testament to the idea that anything is possible. So ladies and gentlemen, please welcome the Executive Director for Push for Change, Mr. Joe Roberts.
Thank you. I'm humbled to be here today. I'm a community investment gone correct. Thanks, Marie. Anytime I have an opportunity to speak to a group of, whether it's researchers, frontline service providers, law enforcement, community workers, municipal leadership, I want to say one thing, and that is thank you. I'm here today because of where I come from and the people and resources that were available to me when I was at my most vulnerable state. I'm here today because groups met and talked about how can we better serve those who are vulnerable, those who, for whatever set of circumstances, have found themselves at a crossroads in their life and they need a hand up and a hand forward. And so the work that I do today is to help facilitate additional conversations to help us get to those places that we need to get to. I also want to call out the fact that I'm probably one of the less educated people in the room when it comes to really understanding the issues that face Penticton. I'm just a person with lived experience, and I'll share that story with you. But the biggest thing that I want to do this morning is talk about possibility mindset. I know that sounds like, okay, well, what does that have to do with the issues that face homelessness in Penticton and the gaps that exist here and where you need to be, where you want to be 2, 5, 10 years from now. Possibility mindset is that thing that we can employ that will help us get to a different place. Great entrepreneurs, great thought leaders, they are people who saw something that could be and then helped facilitate that discussion or did something to get other people to believe it, to follow, to join. When we take a look at cultural shifts and changes in Canada, the United States, things like drinking and driving, it took a generation, but it was grassroots efforts of things like Mothers Against Drinking and Driving and then building relationships with law enforcement that actually got us to change. When I was in grade 9, drinking and driving was cool. It's not today, thank goodness. But it took a lot of work for people to come together to say, what do we need to do within our community? What do we need to do at a municipal, at a legislative level, provincially and federally, for us to actually change so that we can create safer highways and really get rid of this problem? And the fight continues. You guys heard that too, right? Okay, good. I just checking in with you. The 80s were really hard on me. When I hear those things, I always want to make sure it's not just me. Sorry. So here we are. Lived experience is the only thing that I have. And with lived experience, if that's Regis, tell him number 2, final answer. That's the only other phone joke I have. A lived experience allows us to see inside what are some of the antecedents or root causes that create this phenomena of homelessness that we experience. It allows us to collapse the stigma. It's not enough that we simply get to a place where everyone is housed if we can't collapse the judgment and the stigma that is attached to this issue. That's falling short of where we really need to be. When we take a look at what are some of these core reasons that create homelessness, we can better understand what we need to do at a policing level, at an educational level, at a healthcare level, at a mental health level, at a housing level, all these different pieces that contribute to the solution. Right. Could you imagine in Canada if you walked into the hospital and you had a heart problem or diabetes or stroke, and the hospital said, sorry, we're not going to help you because that's lifestyle related. You sort of didn't exercise and ate poorly for a number of years, so we're really not going to support you. You're on your own. When we understand what the root causes are that create homelessness, youth, adult, whatever, then we can maybe take a step backwards and make a shift in how we respond to that. And I know most of you get that. The story is similar across the country. Every year we know what the statistics look like. Hundreds of, 235,000 people experience homelessness. And when you drill into it, it always comes down to a handful of very similar root causes. For me, it was family conflict. For me, it was early childhood trauma. For me, it was then addiction, chronic homelessness. But it didn't start out that way. I grew up in Midland, Ontario, a small community very much like Penticton, maybe a little smaller than Penticton. And growing up, I remember being a happy, well-adjusted young boy. I went to Monsignor Castick's separate school, and I lived about a kilometer from home. And at 3:30, the bell would go off, and I could choose to jump on the bus or I could run home. And I always ran home, or I got on my bicycle and went home, because home for me was this extraordinary place. I loved being at home. I had this dad who was larger than life, this incredible man in my world who I looked up to, who in his shadow I could do or be anything. A father who would say things to me like, I love you, you can do or be anything. I had what a child needed to flourish. I had that love and protection. I had a mom who was a stay-at-home mom. She was extraordinary. I had an older brother, a younger sister, and a little dog named Angus. I had a tree fort in the backyard, and my best friend's name was Darren Morrison. And for the first 8 years, things were awesome. But sometimes life lifes us, doesn't it? And we face adversity, challenge, and sets of circumstances that put us in the fray. When you take a look at what's happened in British Columbia this past summer, tens of thousands of people were displaced from their homes due to the wildfires. Now, they didn't ask to be displaced from their homes. And I want to suggest that homelessness kind of happens that way. It's a series of unfortunate sets of circumstances that put people in harm's way. 1975, we got a knock on the door, and just like that, Dad was gone. The breadwinner of our family had disappeared, and now we were a family of 4. A single mom trying to raise 3 kids who didn't have a full-time job. We didn't have Dad's life insured, and so now we were dealing with poverty. Now we were dealing with fear and insecurity. My mom was a proud woman. She didn't want a handout, and so she did the only thing that she could think to do, and she remarried really quickly. And the man who came into our home, he wasn't anything like my dad. He was a violent, abusive alcoholic. And so I went from a father who would say things to me like, I love you, you can do or be anything, to a man who would tear us down. He'd say things like, you're dumb. You'll never amount to anything. The reality is that not all homes and childhoods are created equal. When we look at an individual, at least when I do, I always ask the question, what happened before that happened? What happened to that young man when he was 7 or 9? What happened to that young lady when she was 12? When we ask those questions, we begin to look through an empathic window to better understand the behavior that is in front of us at that moment. At 9 years old, my brother and his friends were experimenting with alcohol and drugs. I had already been through some fairly substantial early childhood trauma with the death of my father and now the abuse that was going on at home. I joined, and I joined and I escaped through alcohol and drugs, not because I was curious about alcohol and drugs, because I had all this emotional pain that I was dealing with, and I didn't know how to figure it out at 8 and 9 years old. And I wanted to connect. I wanted to connect with my brother and his friends. And I remember that visceral experience of using substances for the first time, and I went home under the influence, and for the first time since my dad died, I felt safe. I felt protected. It gave me the courage to continue in that cloud of emotional uncertainty, and it became something that I continued to use for the next 15 years of my life. I remember how dramatically my life had changed when only 2 years later in that same school, looking up at that clock, and it said 3:20, and instead of being excited about being 3:30 and going home, I remember sitting in that classroom thinking, I don't want to go home. And so it was the groundwork for a perfect storm. By the time I was growing into my early teens, 13, 14, 15, I had a lot of stuff going on between my ears. I had recurring thoughts of suicide. I continued to lean on substances to help get me through that emotional pain, and I started to, as I became and started growing into a man, began to push back against my stepfather and my mother. And at 15, I was that angry young man. At 15, I couldn't get along with my parents anymore, my stepdad and my mom. And at 15, I left. And we see this play out across communities throughout the country. We see that visible homelessness, but there is that portion that is hidden, that couch surfing. And at 15, I didn't have the skills to manage my own life. At 15, I didn't know how to cook, craft dinner, let alone fend for myself in the world. And I had all these other things already going on. And at 15, I stormed out of that house, and I ended up staying in a friend's basement. And over the next several years, I would sort of vacillate in and out of different stages of homelessness. Sometimes I had an apartment or a house. Sometimes I was at a friend's place. Other times, especially towards the end, I was chronically homeless, living on the streets of East Vancouver. By the time I was 16, I'd made several mistakes, and one of the big ones was dropping out of school. There were a lot of folks in my circle of influence that knew I was a train wreck waiting to happen. But the thing that we hear often across, and I have across the country, is, but we didn't have the resources to support. When I was in school, there was so many key indicators that things weren't going right. Things weren't going right at home. And even after I left home, I tried to continue to go to school. But eventually it got to the place where I left school. So I left and I didn't have those two key support systems in my life. I didn't have home and I didn't have school. And I had the beginnings of this drug dependency, and I started to make mistakes in and around the Barrie area, and I decided in 1986 that I would leave. I would go to Vancouver. It was 1986, the World's Fair was on, Expo was on. I went to Toronto, I jumped on a Greyhound bus, and I headed west for fame and fortune. The only problem is I brought a heap load of personal challenges with me, and by the time I landed in that big city, again, I represented another statistic. Small town kid, goes to large town community, not prepared for what's waiting for them in that big city. We see that phenomena. We see it in Vancouver, we see it in Regina, we see it in Winnipeg, we see it in Kenora, we see it in Sault Ste. Marie, we see it in Thunder Bay. Regional hubs that draw folks from smaller communities. And so things went from bad to worse. I began living in the downtown east side. The sporadic housing that I had began to erode, and largely due to the drug dependency and the mental health challenges that I had. Now, my story is only one. There's multiple pathways into homelessness, and this is just one of those stories. But by the time I was in my late teens, I was angry, displaced. I was a regular customer of law enforcement. Wasn't so much a threat as I was a nuisance. And a lot of what I had to deal with was really mental health and addictions related. I was one of those people in the late 1980s that might have made you a little uneasy. Maybe not, because I know I'm talking to some folks who are in the sector, but one of those people who you might walk by and question what their probability of success is. All right. Inside that was a possibility that's standing in front of you today. We invest in possibility. Possibility isn't probability. Probability is when we look at something and we determine that, well, that is the way that is, and it'll likely be like that tomorrow, and the next day, and the next day. But thank goodness I had folks who saw a possibility in me and helped me work towards finding it myself. Possibility is seeing something in someone or in the world and helping them get there. For me, I had a distinct advantage to some of the other friends and folks I've met along the journey, and that is I had resources still. I had a mom that wouldn't quit, and I ended up connecting with a champion. When things finally got really bad, I ended up reaching out and called my mom. 3 days before Christmas, 1989, I had one of the worst days of my life. I'd been living in the downtown east side for a few years. I was addicted to opiates, and I was in this vicious cycle of using drugs, and I got to a point where I began to descend into withdrawal, and I needed $10. I didn't know where it was going to come from. I didn't want to steal. I didn't want to rob or hurt anybody, but I didn't want to feel the way I was feeling anymore. And I remember sitting in Pigeon Park, completely broken, wondering where that next $10 was going to come from. And I got up and I walked into the bar across the street, and I sold the only item I had left in the world that was worth anything. I sold the boots that I was wearing. And I remember walking out of that bar, and the only thing that was merciful is that it was raining. And so people couldn't see that I was crying as I walked up the 100 block of East Hastings. And I asked that question. I said, how did this happen? I'm a good kid. I've got a good mom. I came from a fairly good place. How did I end up on the 100 block of East Hastings? And I didn't really have an answer for that. Fortunately, in the downtown east side, there are dozens of agencies and organizations that are there to support. And I remember in that moment of despair, I did something that I wouldn't have normally done. And I reached out and I said a little prayer. And I would never describe myself as a deeply religious person, although I do believe there's something. And I asked for help. And I made two promises. I made a promise. First promise was, if I get a second chance, I promise I'll give 110% effort. I just needed a chance. And the second promise I made is that if I do get that chance, I'll do something to pay it forward, to help somebody else. The next day I walked into a Salvation Army storefront, soup kitchen kind of a place, and they helped me connect with my mom. And when I got a hold of my mom, she said, "Are you willing to do the work?" And I said, "Yeah, I am." And she flew out to Vancouver from Toronto. She scooped me up. She brought me back to Ontario. And I stayed with her in her basement. What's so important about this part of the story is I went from being on the 100 block of East Hastings to being housed in one day. There's no getting a haircut and pulling your socks up if you don't have housing. There has to be housing first. Without housing, all the other ancillary support services don't work. And I continue to struggle with mental health. And what I mean by that is, one of my patterns was I would use and abuse alcohol and drugs, and it would put me into a state of despondency and depression, and I would then attempt suicide. It was a pattern that unfortunately I was never successful. But one night my mom walked into my room, and I was sitting on the edge of my bed, and I had a weapon, and that frightened her a great deal, and she ran out of the room, and she called the police. And having the experiences that I had throughout my early childhood, I didn't have a favorable relationship with police. I never saw them as helpers. And what ended up happening that night is I met somebody who would end up being a hero of mine. You know, too often we turn on TV and or Twitter feed and we see examples of what happens when those interactions go horribly wrong. That night it went really well. And I met a gentleman named Constable Scott McLeod. Scott diffused a very dangerous situation for both me and him, and had opened a doorway of opportunity for me. I ended up getting an ambulance ride to the local psychiatric unit at Royal Victoria Hospital, where they began to work with me over the next 3 days to stabilize me. That opened a doorway for me to go into a full-time detox facility and then a full-time residential treatment program. If I didn't have Mom, if I didn't have that soup kitchen to walk into, if I didn't have those champions, I honestly don't know where I'd be today. I am here today by the grace and thankful to community support and champions who were there to love me when I was very hard to love. As a direct result of that set of circumstances, I ended up enrolling in Loyalist College after 6 months of alcohol and drug treatment. And I did so not on my own volition. I had a drug counselor who was just a lion, conniving, sneaky. He was, man. He tricked me into going to college because I wouldn't have done it on my own. I really wouldn't have. I didn't know what I wanted to do with my life. I know I didn't want to go back to using alcohol and drugs, but I had such a damaged sense of self-worth and self-esteem that I didn't think school was a place for me. I really didn't think I was smart. I'd failed out of 3 high schools. And anyways, he tricked me, and he said to me, he said, "I can get you 6 more months of housing if you do the application. It doesn't even matter if you get accepted." And I said, "Oh, okay." Well, I already had the housing locked in, but anyways. I've been telling that story for about 25 years, and I was speaking at an addictions, a bunch of addictions counselors in the Kingston, Belleville area, but what was that, 2 years ago? 3 years ago? And I talked about this guy, Brian, who lied to me, and he was in the room. He's like, "I'm right here." I said, "You lied to me." He says, "I know. I lie to everybody. It's the only thing that works." And I was grateful for that. You know, you think about your life. We are the sum of about 5 people. Mentors, Mom, Dad, uncle, first boss, people who poured their lives into us, who helped us see our possibility, helped shape who you are and where you are today. Thanks to Brian, I got a second chance, and you know, I applied at Loyalist College, and I wanted to be a social worker. I wanted to go out and change the world as a social worker. I thought that would be funnier in this room. Sorry. The social work program was full. There was no more seats. So my second choice was business. And I ended up going into business and business marketing and business sales. And I had these really great professors. I put my head down and I started to work hard and I started to do well. And I just little by little, bit by bit, my self-esteem started to come back and I started to believe a little bit in myself. And the months passed and into years. And finally, after three and a half years, I graduated Loyalist College with honors. And I remember walking across the stage just like this, one of these little steps on both sides, and they called out my name. They said, Joe Roberts, Dean's List. I walked across the stage and I shook the dean's hand, and I went down and sat where my mom was sitting. She had this look of peace and pride, and she gave me a kiss on the cheek. She said, I'm so proud of you, son. And all I could think about is how many times she sat in a courtroom or bailed me out of the drunk tank, or just went through so much stuff, eh? But she never gave up. She always had that possibility. I ended up going out into the business world, and I used my transferable experience of being on the street, and I parlayed that into a successful career in being able to communicate with different people and grow businesses. It turns out that all of that life experience actually had tremendous value. I remember my first sales manager, he says, you do so well. He says, don't you deal with rejection? Like when you're doing the sales? And I said, rejection? I said, you want rejection? Try panhandling in front of 7-Eleven. That's rejection. And they just didn't want to buy one of my copiers, and that guy will. So I also understood how to work hard. I understood the context between a bad day and a 200-point drop in the Dow. And so I ended up doing fairly well, fairly quickly in business. And I remember the day when it hit me. You know, sometimes we cover a lot of ground and we forget, or we lose sight of the ground that we covered. But I was driving my car to the office in downtown Vancouver, and I was driving right down Hastings, and I was stuck at the corner of Hastings and Carroll or Abbott, somewhere right down in that epicenter. And I looked out my window, and there was a young man, about 20, pushing a shopping cart, collecting cans and bottles, just like I was. And it hit me how far I'd traveled in just 12 short years. And when I got to the office that day, sitting on my desk was a copy of Canadian Business and Maclean's magazine, and I was on the cover of one and recognized in the other. I'm here today because of a community investment gone correct. I'm here today because of possibility mindset. I want to be your encourager to look for opportunities, to create and fill those gaps, to be able to serve those individuals in this community. And I want to encourage you to tackle that problem with a possibility mindset. It's so easy to get dragged down and to blame or to look outward and say, well, this is wrong and this is wrong and this is wrong. Yes, there's flaws in the system, but if you hold that possibility mindset and you know what your mission and goal is and move forward with relentless action, you can and will accomplish extraordinary things. I got to a place in my life where I felt a tap on my shoulder. I had completed the first of those two promises. I'd become successful. I made the most of the opportunity, but I wanted to do something to give back. In late 1999, I started to publicly share my story, and I did so with a lot of trepidation. I remember the very first time I shared my story to a business audience in Vancouver at the Vancouver Board of Trade, and I was terrified. There I was, a successful guy in the tech sector, and I was about to tell all my peers that I was a former homeless heroin addict on the streets of East Van. And I'd worked so hard to get away from that. And I remember being judged by one or two, and I remember being embraced by hundreds. And I realized that I had a gift, and that gift was personal lived experience, and I had access to a business community. And then I started speaking in schools, and I realized I had an access to young people. I have something that parents would love to have, street cred. and young people will listen. And young people are so extraordinary, you know. And so we started talking about that promise I made to pay it forward. I started to better understand the issues that you understand all too well. Canada is a country that I love. I love my daughter, I love my wife, and I love this country. A country that afforded me so much, a country that allowed me to go from Skid Row to CEO. But we have challenges. We have real issues, and as we celebrate our 150th anniversary, we look at what's great and awesome about Canada. I have to say too, and I wasn't sure about my Donald Trump joke, but I love Donald Trump. I think he's great. I don't think ever before in the history of our country have we looked better. But we have challenges and we have work to do. And there I was, maybe 10 or 15 years ago, speaking into an issue that I didn't understand as well as you do. I didn't understand as well as the Canadian Alliance understands. I didn't understand it as well as the municipal leaders understand. I didn't understand it as well as those frontline service providers and the researchers understood it. So I began to understand it. I began to drill deep. I began to ask questions. I began to talk to some of the smarter people and pour through some of the research and take a look at what are the pragmatic long-term solutions that will create sustainable change. Because I wanted to be a part of a conversation across the country that brings people and resources together, employs a possibility mindset, and takes us to a place where we do make a shift and address homelessness in a different way. So in that context, I started asking those questions, and I sat down, and this was one of my epiphanies, because I actually didn't understand this. And this was introduced to me by a gentleman named Dr. Stephen Gates. And I remember sitting down with Stephen and Melanie Redmond from Away Home, and they explained to me that for some reason in North America and developed countries, we spend a lot of dollars and energy on emergency response. But if we're going to get to a place where we see resolution long term, we need to equally invest in prevention, housing first, as well as continuing to support emergency services. Now, this was an aha moment for me because I really didn't get this. So armed with this, we built relationships with Raising the Roof, Away Home, the Canadian Observatory, and landed on a project called the Upstream. And said, this is what we want to do, this pay it forward. But then began the question, okay, so what are you going to do, Joe, to lend your voice to an engagement strategy across the country? You do the great work here in the community, and I wanted to sort of augment that with that story of personal experience and do something inspiring to instill possibility mindset. So on an airplane ride, I was sitting beside my friend, Dr. Sean Richardson, and I said to Sean, I said, well, what could we do to ignite a conversation about youth homelessness and homelessness in Canada? What could we do to inspire Canadians to bring people outside of the sector and sort of the usual suspects to the table? And Sean said, well, when Canadians want to raise money for things, they run across the country. It's kind of our thing. We're the only country in the world with one highway that goes from St. John's to Victoria and engages 85% of its population. He says, why don't you run across Canada for youth homelessness or homelessness? And I said, why don't you run across Canada? Kind of busy this week. Yeah. But it was that conversation that sparked something called the Push for Change, because what he said next was, he said, okay, maybe you don't run, maybe you walk. And you can create, he says, why not? He says, why don't you push a shopping cart? It's your story, it's a symbol of chronic homelessness, the thing that you're trying to avoid. And along the way, you can engage students, stakeholders, community, and government on what we need to do to prevent, reduce, and end homelessness. You could call it a push for change. And I remember this caffeinated discussion, and I remember the hair on my neck went up. We landed in Calgary, we went and did the consulting work, and I went back. That was October 2011. In the summer of 2012, I walked from Calgary to Vancouver with a shopping cart as a test run, just to see if I could push a shopping cart through the Rocky Mountains. I was bored. And we successfully got that done, and so we stepped back and we built the national campaign. The biggest thing that we needed to do was to get sponsors. And I remember everyone telling us, you'll never get people to sponsor that. Before we left St. John's, Newfoundland, we were fully funded, which allowed us to take every single nickel that we've collected across the country and put it towards the work that we support. On the 1st of May, 2016, how many days ago, Marie?
481.
481 days ago, I started walking. I get up at 5 o'clock every morning. I walk 24 kilometers through the rain, through the snow, through a Canadian winter in Northern Ontario to push for change and to lend my voice to the good work that you're here to support today. And as of today, I've walked over 8,600 kilometers and will complete in Vancouver on September 29th. Our goal right now, we're resting in hope. We just got invited to this event, so we backtracked to be here today. We will pick up tomorrow, and I'll start to walk into towards Harrison and Mission, then we go up to Whitehorse, then we come back. We walk through the entire island down to Victoria, and then we'll double back. And we have our grand finale event September 29th. If you're in the area or know friends in the area, we want to invite you to come out and walk with us and to complete in front of the Vancouver Library on September 29th. We'll give you a bit of a peek into what we accomplished over the last 16 months. We didn't know if anybody would even care, but we had the courage to fail, and we had the courage to continue to push forward in the face of uncertainty. And this little video captures what we've accomplished in the last 16 months. Public engagement is the one thing that I can do. I don't understand what most of you do, but I want to support it. I want to see solutions. I don't want to live in a country that has disposable people. Everything that you saw there was produced by a team of 3. Campaigns that have come across the country in the past have had teams of 30, 40, 60 people. The 2010 Olympics, Claire's Big Ride, that's us. Everything that you saw. Bobby, he drives the support vehicle. I walk and talk. Marie does everything else. She has 29 roles. I'm not kidding you. She has put in 16-hour days for the last 4 years. Creating change is hard work. It's possible, but it takes everything you have. And the push for change was successful because we had communities to engage with and because of the work and dedication that Marie put in. So let's give Marie some love. Marie is also the love of my life and my wife. And we have a love story with inside the campaign. We actually dated in grade 10 and lost track of each other for 28 years and then reconnected 4 years ago. 5 years ago? 5 years ago? It's going to be a long ride back to hope. And just before the campaign, we got married. So in a lot of ways, the push for change is kind of our honeymoon. Yeah, she doesn't find that amusing either. When I was walking in the middle of Newfoundland, I was 60 kilometers from any community, literally in the middle of nowhere. If you've been to Newfoundland, it's a beautiful place, but it's vast, and it's unpopulated. And I looked down in the pouring rain, and there was a beat-up old penny. I remember picking it up and asked myself, what does this mean? Why did I find a penny in the middle of nowhere, on the side of the road in the pouring rain? And I knocked it on the side of my cart, and I got rid of some of the dirt. And as I held that penny in my hand, I noticed that Didn't look like the other pennies. A little beat up, a little worse for wear. It had patina. It spent a couple of nights outside. I found it in the street. What occurred to me is that penny, regardless of its condition or where I found it, and regardless of whether it looks like the other pennies, it can never, ever, ever lose its value. And I shared that penny, and I gave that penny to our Prime Minister when we visited, and I told him that story. This picture was taken the eve of the 2017 budget, and Prime Minister gave me a hug, which was kind of weird. I was expecting a handshake, but. And he said to me, "You're going to like the budget tomorrow." And there's a long way to go, but an $11.2 billion investment in social housing is a good start over 11 years. There are a lot of other things that we need to do. But I'm encouraged by the direction that we're going. In the end, we asked the country for change, and we had over 430 events, and we've seen a shift, and we're excited about where we can go. In the end, there are only 3 windows upon which we can view the issue of homelessness. There's window number 1, which is the window of empathy. It's a window I can't help but look through because of my own experience. A window that says it's the right thing to do, that housing is a human right, and in a country as rich and prosperous as Canada, everyone ought to have a safe place to transition and reach their possibility. But maybe you don't share that view, and that's okay. Let's look through window number 2, the window of pragmatism, the window that says this makes more fiscal sense when we're looking at one taxpayer, that if we don't look at pragmatic, long-term, sustainable solutions, we'll continue to see the problem grow unchecked. The window that says it makes more sense to invest in affordable housing and housing first and prevention models while supporting emergency services. And lastly, there is the window number 3, in the window of indifference, that having been presented with window 1 or 2, we still choose to look through the window of indifference. Everything that the Push for Change stands for is to eliminate window number 3. In closing, I want to say that the one thing that I've learned doing this work across the country is that sometimes I've been misunderstood. And what I learned is that the killer that will unravel absolutely everything is divisiveness. The communities that succeed are communities that collapse divisiveness and collaborate and work together to find solutions that serve the individuals that we're trying to serve. And if we can get there, we can see that change that we're all trying to push for. Thank you. Miigwech.
To help thank you and also give an update or talk a little bit more about Youth Resource Center, I want to call up Kim Lister from Community Foundation to give an update and continue with our program.
Your words are very inspiring. One of the things that the Community Foundation of the South Okanagan-Similkameen believes in is community. And we believe that community is about supporting belonging. In my estimation, the yearning to belong is almost as compelling as food. And that if you take a look at the word belonging and unravel it, it's actually a longing to be. If you don't feel like you don't belong, you don't get to be the person you're supposed to be. Housing is a critical part of helping people be the people they're supposed to be. The Community Foundation tries to lead conversations that help solve complex solutions, and we do that based on a belief that if we keep talking to one another, we can find our way through it. I want to quote Adam Kahane. He says that there are 2 options going forward. There's the practical option, where we get down on our knees and pray for a band of angels to come down and sort out these complex issues for us. Or there's the miraculous option where we continue to talk to one another and find our way forward together. Whatever the problem, community is part of the solution. The Community Foundation of the South Okanagan-Similkameen has been doing work in community for over 20 years. Our work is about building and sustaining community through investments of money, leadership, and trying to create innovation and solutions. So I took leadership from you, or at least thoughts from you, Joe, about we invest in possibility. And to do that, over the last 20 years, we've invested more than $2 million in grants to various initiatives throughout the South Okanagan-Similkameen. We've been leading conversations through our vital signs reports, and two of the issues that have come up consistently are the issue of housing and the gap between rich and poor. Our current initiative that we've been working on for a few years with the leadership of youth and a number of people in this room who are part of the solution is our youth engagement strategy. There were 3 pillars to the strategy. The first one is to try and collapse stigma, to change the conversation about youth and who youth are in our community and what their needs are. The second goal is to equalize opportunity. Many kids in our community don't have access to opportunities to participate in free and low-cost activities, so we're trying to change that. And the third pillar is to create a youth center, and that youth center would operate as a safe place that youth can come to that provides integrated resources, so some of the emergency responses, but with a heavy focus on prevention and youth voice. We have been successful in leveraging our relationships, our philanthropic connections, to build some support. We're working with a number of organizations in the community who are part of the circle of contribution and commitment to this, and the Community Foundation hopes that the youth center will be open, or at least started by the end of this year. We have several youth who are leading the work in the community. We have support from Rotary, we have support from the city, and we have support from independent contributors. I guess the most important thing is that we want there to be every door to be the right door, and we believe that the youth center is going to be an example of a place where youth can come across a spectrum of needs, not just a particular group of youth, but every youth in the community will feel like it's a safe place for them to come. And that'll bring the amazing resources in this community, the amazing possibility in this community together.
Have the privilege of being the co-chair of the 100 Homes Penticton committee that is supported by the United Way. And this initiative has brought together local leaders from nonprofit and from business and from government organizations to do exactly what you were talking about, Joe, is to collaborate and try to eliminate divisiveness and to work together to develop innovative solutions and really look at how we can do things better together than we ever could do by ourselves. To date, we've housed 56 people towards our goal of connecting 100 people experiencing homelessness with a place that they can call home. And we're very pleased with that. We know there's still a lot of work to do, but we're pleased with our accomplishments to date. We're also privileged to be working with the city, the Community Foundation, and the United Way to bring Joe here today. And later on, we're also going to hear from Wally Check to help inspire our learning, our thinking, and how we can better collaborate. And Joe, as an expression of our gratitude for you sharing your story this morning, which I am deeply moved by and feel incredibly honored and privileged to have been here this morning. And inspired. It's our privilege to present you with a check for $1,000 on behalf of 100 Homes Penticton and the United Way to go towards the push for change. And thank you so much. I wanted to say one more thing. I know that you got up incredibly early this morning to detour to be here with us, and I just wanted to thank you both for rejigging your schedule to be with us this morning. Thank you so much.